Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Lessons of Vietnam. I'm Bill Dixon with my co-host, Mr. Bob Matthews. Tonight we were excited about our guest, but he had a conflict and had to bow out this time. We'll have him later. It was Colonel Hein Vo, who was a major in the South Vietnamese military, who followed right up to the last day, was captured and put into a re-education camp for a little over 8 years, and then when they let him out, he was a boat refugee and escaped. Looking forward to having him later. Tonight, Bob and I are going to be starting the first part of 4 parts, the first section of it, the war at home. If you're tuning in, we'd like for you to call in and tell us what you were doing and how the things going on back here affected us. You can call us at 919-518-9773 and tell us all about your time during the 60s. It was a very interesting time during the 60s. Bob, there's a lot of things going on in the 60s, probably more things than we've ever had before or since going on in the 60s.
Well, Bill, thank you again and welcome to the show. My name is Bob Matthews, and tonight's show, as Bill mentioned, is dealing with the war at home. And it's a many-faceted show tonight. It's 2 parts. And he mentioned about Hein Vo. Colonel Hein Vo was very much part of the war at home because America had to, after Vietnam, accept, and we have, the influx of the Vietnamese in America, where they became into our country. People have fought for their freedom along our sides and became American citizens and are still helping in Vietnam today. But as Bill mentioned, the decade of the 60s, I think right now, being an ex-history teacher, is unmatched in history for the things that went on. This country was afforded so much progress in the 60s, and there were casualties. Like we talked many times before about the air warfare in Vietnam, the war on the water, and of course the war on the ground. Now the 4-part series starts tonight, and Bill has mentioned the war at home. This includes you, because you were the participant this time. The other 3 episodes, you were the spectator. We were the participants. Now that we came home from Vietnam and we walked into a different war front, if you will, a different kind of conflict. We changed clothes, of course, but things were not as easy as we thought they would be. But when we talk about the war at home, we encourage you tonight to share your experiences with us, because this is where this country became of age. I mean, so many things happened that we are feeling the residue of this today. I mean, the media, the civil rights, everything that happened. I guess we could say this, it's an oft-used term, but the playing field was leveled. It didn't matter who you were, what color you were, what sex you were. America was even Steven. It's time to get on and build this country. Well, the Vietnam vets came home, and I've said this many times, teaching Vietnam around the country. The most used word in Vietnam, the favorite 4-letter word, was not beer. It was home. You think about coming after a day of work, coming home, putting up your feet, seeing your family, having a good tired. And all of a sudden, thousands of men and women, and what I've said before, 10,000 women served in Vietnam, and we know there are 8 on the wall. But thousands and thousands of young men and women came home from Vietnam looking for a reward for giving up a year of their life. And a lot of them, Bill, ran to a buzzsaw. They came home to an angry nation, and they looked at each other and said, what's going on here? We fought for freedom 12,000 miles away. We came home and were treated like we lost. What do you think?
Well, it was because of people your neighbor would disappear, and it'd be a while before you see him again, and it was hard, I think, to a certain extent. In the other wars, the entire country was involved.
Yes.
But with Vietnam, the soldier was usually gone for a year. It's almost like he went off to vacation or something and would reappear back home. So the American people, really all they knew was what they saw on the news. As you and I have talked before, that's where the news media and a lot of the press changes came in, the war being television war. And news definitely changed longer by that time. Up until that time, I think the news was actually news. With the Vietnam War, it started coming on as an entertainment show with personalities.
Well, Bill, you start to think about when the war at home, we came home in the late 60s, early 70s, the anchors on the three networks, there wasn't cable then. The three network anchors, you think of Walter Cronkite, the most believable man in America, Howard K. Smith, rest his soul, and Huntley Brinkley. Huntley Brinkley reported, "Good night, Chet. Good night, David." Yeah. And it looked like these men and women were not only reporting the news, they were making the news. And people listened in, and Walter Cronkite had his famous ending phrase at the end of every newscast. He would say, "In America, that's the way it is." And everybody said under their breath, "Yes, it is. Thank you, Walter." He could run for president and won. Yeah. He was so believable. But as you mentioned, the war at home, I think, was difficult because the American people, like you said just a minute ago, were used to a clear-cut victory. I mean, World War II was clear-cut. We won. Germany and Japan were defeated. This war, we came home and we were still there. Men came home, men were still there. It was like an episode war.
Yeah. Well, they called the Korea the Forgotten War because it was ended with a treaty, so it wasn't a clear-cut win there, and I think that's why everybody just kind of brushed it off to the side and just almost ignored it. And the Korean veterans, where there was so much turmoil when we came home is with the war protesters, which they didn't have in the Korea. Going on. The women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the gay movement, national voting rights, sexual revolution, the anti-war guys, all those were out there doing their thing. Of course, the news media was right there to record it and so forth. So there was all those things going on, and there was a lot of frustration, a lot of not quite certain what was going on. So when we came home, of course, they blamed us, and rather than the policy of the government, which is who makes war, then to send the young men out. So a lot of frustration and apprehension in the country.
And Bill, I also think that the war at home was like a different levels because men came home to different areas. Like you came home, you were still in the service. A lot of men got out of the service after Vietnam, ready to civilian life. I was just a few months, I was still in the service up in New York. And I think a lot of times the war at home depended on where you came home. Like you came home to maybe, which I did, kind of rural Pennsylvania, kind of low-key. People were interested that you were glad you're back, those that knew you. But what I found was what I used to call blissful ignorance. There were so many good people that didn't know enough about Vietnam to engage in a conversation. So they watch the news, they might see a protest, they might see a flag burning, something like this. You came home to the South. Was it different?
Well, I came home and I still had plenty of service time left, so I came home, did my leave. I didn't see but just some family and so forth. Then I went to Fort Hood, Texas, which I was surrounded by a lot of returning Vietnam vets there. So I was isolated from getting out in the general public pretty much. But when I did come home, then I would nobody told me, I didn't speak to anybody about Vietnam. I was a Vietnam vet or whatever. So most of the people when I came home didn't know about it. And I think also at the time, it depended on what year you came home.
That's true.
Because up until 67 or the Tet Offensive of 68, America was somewhat behind the war, I think, the ones that, besides the war protesters. When 68 and Walter Cronkite came along, as we like to call him Walter Concrete, came along and made his statement that he'd been lied to all that time and that and the war was not winnable. That's when the American public, because he was the most trusted man in on the news, completely changed their thought patterns and everybody all of a sudden wanted out. And
the many things that I really enjoyed about, I'll say, post-Vietnam in this country, even though we call it the war at home, the war at home had some good points because people were starting to ask hard questions. They were starting to say no. they were starting to protest more and more. They weren't afraid to stand up at a meeting and say, no, I won't. I came home when I started to teach school in 1968. As you mentioned, what a year. The roof blew off the world in 68. And people were saying, wait a minute, I didn't know that. Asking questions about this, asking questions about that. And then they talked to you, being a Vietnam veteran, and they were a little bit, I guess the word would be frustrated, because they didn't want to criticize you because they knew you, but they wanted to know why you went to Vietnam, and was the year worth it? Was the entire effort worth it? I recently told you that I was at the wall in D.C. with my grandchildren, and I've talked to them for years about Vietnam, and they're interested in why we did it, why we went so far to try to stop communism. It was a foreign policy decision, and we didn't volunteer for that. Our government asked us to serve, and we did. And I do think a lot of the vets, when they came home, weren't angry, they were disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't expect, I mean, I never expected a big parade, bells and whistles, but I did expect a handshake and maybe a cold beer.
I've heard many times, here we are over here fighting, and nobody seems to give a damn. While we're over here risking our lives, we go back home, and you can't tell anybody whatsoever.
Well, a lot of the veterans that I've talked to over the years, came home, and they used the word underground. They didn't disappear. They just basically became antisocial. They wanted to be involved. They wanted to coach Little League. They wanted to do all this in the community. But they had that thing you mentioned 3 weeks ago, that thing on their shoulder, that friend called Vietnam, and they could not let go of Vietnam. And they didn't have an outlet where someone would say, okay, why don't we sit down and talk about it? One of the lessons of Vietnam, I think we learned with the war at home, was we had a lot of messed up kids coming home, and there was no aftercare policy.
Well, not only do we have a lot of messed up kids, but there were people who were war protesters, and some of the veterans coming home were somewhat telling lies about what was going on over there, or stretching the truth. So I think a lot of people were scared of us.
That could be.
You were coming home as a Vietnam vet. They didn't know whether you were going to go crazy and start shooting or whatever, because we were all considered dope addicts and baby killers and crazy and everything else. So I think a lot of people didn't talk to us and kind of shunned us because they were scared to ask questions, because they didn't know whether we were going to just go off on them or whatever.
I think you're right, Bill. And I think another thing, too, in defense of a lot of the Vietnam veterans, that when they came home and they saw the climate of the United States, some was friendly, some was inquisitive, some was ignorant, but they had this feeling of unfinished business. I mean, they grew up in the era of a word called the duration. A lot of their uncles and their fathers and so forth went to serve in World War II, and they came home when it was over. They didn't have a tour of duty. They had a tour of duty when it was over.
Yeah.
And a lot of the vets that I've talked to over the years, and that's why a lot of them are going back to Vietnam today. They're trying to put things to rest.
Yeah.
What they didn't do then, they maybe can do now. And I do think that's part of this driving of the bridge back. But basically, with the unfinished business of the Vietnam vets, and then they got on with their lives. And now, as you've noticed throughout the country, the war at home is basically over, but the questions are not.
No.
I mean, there's more and more interest in the 60s, in the Vietnam era, in the aftermath, and people still say not another Vietnam. There will never be another Vietnam. But as far as you can tell me tonight, what do you think of the interest level just mushrooming on Vietnam?
Well, the thing about it is, it was easy to say, well, it's because we started the 50th commemoration of the Vietnam War, but I don't think most people even realize it's the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. I guess we're getting to the age of the World War, where the World War II veterans were kind of taking their place to a certain extent as the senior soldiers, so to speak.
Senior
and
veterans.
People are starting to ask questions, and as well as I do, by going into schools and so forth, that the kids don't know anything about the war, but they started studying it and so forth with their teachers and so forth, and they find it very interesting. and start having great questions. It creates conversations at home. It creates conversations between themselves because to them it's quite an exciting period.
Yes,
Woodstock, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everybody remembers that time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the sexual revolution, make love, not war.
You were part of the sexual revolution, weren't you?
No, I got left out. The pill came out. That's a good time, I guess, for the sexual revolution for the pill to come out. But all that stuff was going on, and even today, the music we listen to, a lot of the clothes, the haircuts we have today, and of course the voting rights and women's rights and so forth, all came out of that period of time. And we still haven't got it right, all of it solved, but everything, just about everything touches us today, come out of the '60s.
And you see a guy or girl from now and then in the 60s. I always call them stuck in the 60s. And I'd be a little amiss tonight, as Bill mentioned, senior veterans. I'd be a little negligent, I should say, if I didn't mention Mr. Dixon is due to have a birthday this Sunday, where I'm not going to give you his age on the air because he's bashful about it. But he's been very instrumental over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, I'll tell you now, Bob. The reason Bob doesn't want to give you his age because we share a birthday. Both of us were born September 29th, 1944. So I'm not going to give you his age, but if you can figure that out, see what it is. But he is definitely getting to be a senior soldier.
I like that.
It's kind of funny. He's a Yankee from Pennsylvania. I'm a Southerner from North Carolina. His mother's name was Pearl. My mother's name was Pearl, and we met through the North Carolina Vietnam veterans, and we're best friends. And we share a birthday. We share this show here we're doing tonight, as well as the excitement of going around the country and sharing the Vietnam story and eliminating a lot of those myths that came out of the 60s and 70s of the Vietnam veteran and so forth. A lot of the things that went on in Vietnam was actually going on here too.
Sure.
In the 70s, early 70s in Vietnam, it was the same people. You had the same problems going on here with the drugs that were going on here. The civil rights movement. All those people all went to Vietnam and became Vietnam veterans, and so they carried a lot of the stuff with Vietnam with them. And Vietnam, I think, just kind of personified and blew up a little bit some of the problems going here and made them even more strong, which fed some of the myths that came out of Vietnam and so forth.
Well, another thing about the war at home, it caused people to do more research. It caused people that wanted to know the right answers to read more. And as Bill mentioned about many of the giant people in the 60s, the assassinations, it made teaching history come alive. Mm-hmm. I mean, you talked about high water marks, and you started talking about Vietnam. It seemed like Vietnam was always in the middle. And we mentioned a couple of weeks ago about a Vietnam veteran, and you say to a veteran, why can't you let Vietnam alone? I mean, it's 40 years ago. And they say, I have. The day I walked off the plane in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I saw my wife, I put Vietnam to sleep. But it won't let me go. I've let it go for years. And I asked you before, I saw a Vietnam veteran recently at a high school reunion. There was a couple of us went to Nam from Pittsburgh, my small town. And I said to him, when were you in Vietnam? And he said, last night. And we talked about that. It's something that is always there with you. You share it with your loved ones. They know it bothers you. They know you're at peace with it. But they also know, and I know I've said this many times, but we have a survival responsibility. The war at home was tough, but we knew what we were getting into. The war in Vietnam was tough. We knew what we were getting into. We're grown men. We can handle things there and here. And now, as we go around the country and talk about Vietnam, whether it's in the air, on the water, or the war at home, I think we have to give people their just due. Some were so angry, Bill. Some were so misled. Some went to Canada. Some went underground. Some threw bags of human waste. Some hurled names at us. Some were uninformed, and some went to prison.
And some just ignored us.
Some ignored us. Some men I know wouldn't put Vietnam on their applications. The war at home turned us into, I think, defensive people. Mm-hmm. And then we became offensive, And I don't think I've ever bragged about Vietnam, and I never will. I was asked to go to fight for freedom in a foreign country, and I went. My father was asked to go to fight against tyranny in a foreign country, and he went. He set the path for me. Many of my heroes have always bucked the odds, and they went. They didn't cry, they didn't make excuses. So we came home and we faced this war at home. And you'll meet people all over the country. Go ahead.
One of the things you said a while ago, though, I did take a little bit of, we knew what we were doing when we were going. I'm not certain that I knew what I was doing or why I was there. I know they said I was going to fight communism and so forth, but I didn't know what to expect. I didn't even know where this Vietnam place was. All I saw was what little short things they showed on TV and so forth,
Sure.
that people were getting blown up and they were shooting at each other. And so I didn't know a whole lot about it. Doing basic training, we just said you're going to go there, you're going to get killed if you don't listen to what we're telling you. So I didn't know a whole lot about it.
Yeah.
You and I were somewhat unique when we went to Vietnam. We were both married 3 years. My wife told me if I got killed in Vietnam, she'd kill me. And in a lot of ways, being over in Vietnam and listening to news coming from over here, I was more worried about her here with all the violence and so forth was going on here. It seemed like there was more violence going on here than it was in Vietnam, which was also a point of frustration for us. We're over there fighting a war, and it seemed like the war was back here.
Right.
And I remember exactly where I was when I got word that Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Sure.
When I was over there, the 60s was big on the assassinations between John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy,
right.
and some others around the country. That was kind of unusual for this country to these assassinations and so forth.
Yeah, we don't normally kill our leaders; we just argue with them.
Yeah.
You know, a thing too about the war at home was we had a heads up because Vietnam was such a come and go place. I want to say lucid, but it was one of those things where it was fluid. Is you'd be in Vietnam, you'd be replaced, another few guys would come in. Well, everybody that came in told you about home. They said, well, this is happening at home. Be ready for this. Be ready for this. So we didn't walk off the plane naive. I walked off the plane and I knew that I was walking into a nation that was inquisitive, had some very hard questions. I hoped that I would someday teach school and teach history, which I did, had the privilege of doing that for a long time. But I had a tough time at home answering some of the questions because I didn't know the answers. Mm. And so we started to work a few years ago, and one of the hardest questions that I could not answer was this deal about POW MIA that we're both so involved in to this day, that did we actually leave people behind knowingly? And, you know, like I said, people are students of history, and people know that every war, every time you go into a foreign land and have a conflict, you leave people behind. That old expression, we leave no one behind, is an expression only. We always leave people behind. Hope to go back and get them. Can't always do that.
Yeah. Well, you know, along those lines, I think one of the problems we had also that added to some of the myths in World War II and so forth, they put you on a boat and brought you home.
Right.
You had plenty of time with other veterans to kind of cool down, readjust to, because war is not a pretty thing. It's not a pretty thing at all. But you were around other veterans to kind of talk and handle it and adjust. Where Vietnam, you could be in the jungles fighting today, and the next day you ask your mother to pass the blankety-blank potatoes. And you can't understand why she suddenly turns pale in the face because you forgot the language we used in Vietnam.
Yes.
and still using it. But you came home, you were a little cautious, sounds would make you jump or whatever, and that was something they weren't quite prepared for themselves.
Well, I think that's a good defense, but I think a lot of the guys that did come home from Vietnam themselves might have been their own worst enemy.
Yeah.
Because some of them came home, they maybe used Vietnam as an excuse. They couldn't get a job. They blamed Vietnam for everything, and that wasn't fair. Vietnam was a terrible time for most of the guys in Vietnam. It was a time in their lives where they had to just, we talked many times about this, put things on the shelf for a year. Your career, your life, everything. But you had to do it for your country and for your family. And then when you came home, you were expected to be strong. be expected to get into your career, into your life, into your marriage, and be strong, not be weak. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for the Vietnam veterans that blame their lot in life on Nam.
Yeah, I have a relative that has lived a kind of a different lifestyle.
I understand.
And one day I would have said something about him, and some of my other relatives says, "Well, you have to overlook him. He was in Vietnam." And I'm going, "Well, wait a minute. You remember the year I wasn't here? I mean, he was a bum before he went to Vietnam, and he came back. He was still a bum. I mean, it had nothing to do with Vietnam. It was very convenient to come back and claim." Now there are, there is some people who came back with emotional problems.
Oh yes,
and
so.
We need to support them, post-traumatic stress and so forth. But again, a lot of people came back and just continued to be in whatever they were when they were there, and not necessarily the good guy.
Well, one of the nice things about coming home to a country that is angry and happy and disillusioned is it gives you a chance to fix it. I mean, you can fix things. You go into your community, into your school, into your family, and you can answer the questions. You can say, of course it was tough in Vietnam. Of course we answer the questions. And one of the rules we've always used is the students, whether it's in college or in the high schools we talk in, we will not say no to any question. If someone says to Bill Dixon, was there drugs in Vietnam? Was there prostitution in Vietnam? You must tell these students and adults that ask these questions that were on the edge of Vietnam watching the war. You must tell them the truth. And then the war at home will not be as anticlimactic, it'll be informed.
Yeah. That's just, it's. We have to also remember when you say drugs in Vietnam, yes, there were drugs in Vietnam, but there were also drugs here.
Yes.
The hippie movement with LSD and marijuana was very strong here, and a lot of the people who went to Vietnam and got involved with marijuana and whatever came back and started smoking. But some of the people from here who was already taking LSD and marijuana went to Vietnam and continued. So you can't blame the drugs on being in Vietnam either. To a certain extent.
Remember one of the students at school in Eastern Elements, where our good friend Dave Ebert is.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking after class, and they said, when you guys came home to this angry nation, they asked about drugs. What was the most popular drug in Vietnam? And I said alcohol.
Yes.
Because most men in Vietnam and women were warned about the water. Alcohol was usually safe. It was sealed in cans or bottles. And you weren't a drunk, but you drank beer, and it was good for you. And you drank a lot of beer. And it was the drug of choice. Now, I don't think many men came back alcoholics, but they certainly didn't go on the wagon when they came back.
Well, I tell you what, you can be out humping in the jungle, and a guy has had a bunch of beers that night. He has a tendency to smell really good when that alcohol starts sweating out his pores. But the water was interesting. It was like drinking a swimming pool with all the chlorine and stuff in it. So the drug of choice was beer. The Vietnamese people are very inventive people. I have pictures of houses made out of Pabst Blue Ribbon cans, flattened out and so forth. So yes,
a pair of shoes made out of a tire.
Yeah, a pair of shoes made out of a pair of Michelin tires. So yes, the alcohol was the number one drug of choice. Then, of course, the strong marijuana. We had in my company we had we call them the potheads. I think we had 4 or 5 that would go out at night and smoke the dope. And it was interesting. We go on alert. I'd help him get dressed and hand him his rifle and send him out one door, and I'd go out the other door because I want to make sure I stayed. But back in early in the 70s, because of all the things that were going here, the drugs were so prevalent here that a lot of the people who went to Vietnam were already into drugs.
Yes.
And that's when the hard drugs, opium and heroin, started coming in the 70s.
Well, they took their lifestyle with them.
Yeah.
They just changed uniforms.
Yeah.
I remember coming home and I noticed, like I said earlier, the not fear but apprehension. Let's not ask Bob a question. I said, let's. We used to have these cookouts at the faculty, and I said, why don't we just get to the chase and ask all the questions you want to? And people would finally come clean and started saying, what was it like? What was it like? You mentioned the water, the drugs, the beer. We had a place, too, at our base camp. It was called the Garden. People would go out and smoke marijuana. They'd say, why don't you come out? And I said, no thanks. I was a nerd. I said, I'm a teacher. I'm married. I don't need that. I'm going to get through this year. I'm going to survive. Go back to the world, as we called it. Little did I know the world was an angry place. And when I teach the war at home to students, to me it's the most entertaining, the most energetic part of teaching Vietnam, because you're teaching people that weren't there. You're teaching people that are students of Vietnam, and they want to know what it was like. What are the Vietnamese people like?
Yeah.
And you know the affinity I have for the Vietnamese. I've always respected them. And we went to fight for their freedom. And I asked the colonel, who was going to be here tonight, one question. And he will be here later in the show. Did we make a difference in Vietnam? And boy, I wanted him to say yes, because I want to make a difference. And he did. He goes, you hit communism right in the face.
Yeah.
Right in the face. I like that.
Yeah. You know, to a certain extent, also, the Vietnam veteran is starting to ask, because as we talked about before, when you were in Vietnam, it's like you had blinders on a mule. You only knew where you were, what you were doing that particular day, and depending on where you were, what your job was, and what year you're there, your story is totally different. So when we get together as Vietnam veterans and tell a little bit about our story and where we were and compare it to before, as I talked to a guy today at the VA doctor's office, he was in the Air Force, and he was talking about
he couldn't.
Well, depends on who you talk to, but he talked about people jumping out of a perfectly good airplane and landing in the mud and so forth. And I asked him, "Did you ever see a leech?" He said, "A leech? What's that?"
I know what a leech is.
They flew and went back home and into nice, comfortable barracks and so forth. And so there was. Everybody's story is totally different. The other day we had Al Ilion.
Yes.
He was on the water. He was on the water, but he never got down in the swamp and got the leeches. It's hard to believe, as many as they were.
Well, Bill, you make an excellent point, because many of the Vietnam veterans, when they came back from Vietnam, actually became students of the war. And as we've started to teach the lessons of Vietnam, more and more veterans are getting aboard and saying, wait a minute, I've got a better story than that. I've got this part of the war. I'll be an expert on this. And we've built this library into such a degree of books that everybody that went to Vietnam and has learned more and more about it are so much better in the classroom. And the students, we got our list yesterday of the Wake County's teachers that are teaching Vietnam in Wake County schools this year. Most of you are aware of the fact that we now have over 24 high schools and 38 middle schools. And every school in Wake County that engages in social studies, whether it's U.S. history, advanced U.S. history, or lessons of Vietnam, are teaching Vietnam to their students. And so I can say this to the Vietnam veterans: the war at home was rough, but the war at home can be won, and we're on our way.
You know, we think about the war at home. We talked about the Vietnam veterans, but you also have to remember the mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, wives, girlfriends. We have a good friend who was going to get married. He had orders for Vietnam, and they put off the marriage, but he never came home.
Right.
And you went back to Vietnam with her several years later, or several years ago, and she got to have somewhat closure because she got to see where her fiance died and so forth. And, but you had a lot of that stuff going on, and you had a lot of marriages broke up because of being gone that year. A lot of marriages got stronger. A lot of fathers and sons got closer together when the son came home as a soldier and started. And the father had a different. He wasn't just his son; he was also a fellow soldier to a certain extent. So a lot of things, not just for the Vietnam vets, but a lot of the families were at home. You got to think about it today. You hear on the news that 5 people were killed today in Afghanistan. Don't know that happened, but just think about it. Everybody who has a family member in Afghanistan's heart stops a little bit And that's the way it was in Vietnam. But today they've got Skype and computers and cell phones and so forth. Back in our day, we didn't have all that stuff. So the families didn't know for certain whether it was them, their loved one or not, and everybody was uptight. I know my wife several times went to work in hysterics because of what she heard going on. In fact, sometimes I heard we were under attack and didn't even know about it until I got her letter saying that Long Binh was under attack. It was 55,000 troops there. It may have been on the other side. Or when the ammo dump blew up, I definitely knew that one. But
well, Bill, you heard the expression, ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
A lot of people chose not to watch the news because no news is good news. And we've all seen, like, Saving Private Ryan, when you're notified by a telegram, and we were soldiers once. But you mentioned about people at home. And to pay respect to the story you told about Barbara Abernathy, when Barbara went back to Vietnam, Barbara read about this course years ago, and she called me and said, you're teaching a class at Enloe. Could I sit in for one period? And she sat in every day the rest of the year. And she went to Vietnam, and we found out where her fiancé, Donald Mackenzie, was killed. And through a guide in Vietnam and through Marcia Selva, we went to the village, and she got a jar of dirt. Got the dirt all the way back to Lumberton, North Carolina, went to Donald Mackenzie's grave and had a ceremony with his family and put him to rest in her mind. And you mentioned about families in the war at home, how apprehensive they were and how nervous and strong they were. I think Betty wrote me every day for 365 days. My sister Judy, who I talk about often, was in 6th grade. And she told me just recently that she defended the Vietnam vets when people screamed at them. She said, wait a minute. And people had to take a stand. And sometimes you had to read a little bit. Very interesting. The war at home had many fronts.
Yeah. Where were you during the 60s, and how did the war in Vietnam affect you? Give us a call at 919-518-9773 and share. Do you remember where you were during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Do you remember where you were when Martin Luther King was assassinated, or either one of the Kennedys assassinated? What was going on in your life in the 60s? What was were you a teenager, or were you our age, draft age? How did you fare with the draft? I know when we went in, there was a draft, and later they went to the lottery.
Yes, very much so.
I think the lottery was in 71 when they went to the lottery.
71, right in there.
Yeah. Up until then, it was a draft.
I was lucky enough to be drafted.
Yeah, I'm from Wilson, North Carolina, so I went through the draft board in Wilson was actually one I worked through, and up until I got dumb enough to join the Army to beat the draft.
Well, you know, Vietnam has burnt so many memories in your mind. Like when I went to the draft induction center in Pittsburgh, I never saw more guys in their underwear in my life. I never went to again. And he said, this is a draft board. And I thought, hey, I'm married, I'm going to be a teacher, I'll beat this rep. And they came back and said, you're disgustingly normal. Go home. Pack a bag. I said, thank you. That was the end of that story.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife worked for a woman who had also had someone in Vietnam, so it was very fortunate that when she had her little spells and so forth, that her boss understood and so forth, and they would get together and talk about what was going on and so forth, and the families would get together and discuss what they saw on the news and that sort of stuff. But the news was just that little clips. It's like Paul Harvey used to say, that's the rest of the story.
Oh, yes.
You didn't see the rest of the story on the news about Vietnam. You just saw the little clip that kind of got you teased, and all of a sudden it was gone. And what is it? What was it? What happened? It goes back somewhat like the picture of the little girl running down the road that was burned by napalm.
Yes.
You saw that, and all of a sudden everybody's mind went, well, those dirty American soldiers burned that little girl, which was not the truth at all.
Years later, it all came out.
Yeah.
And you were talking about TV and that little box in the corner, the daily body count, things like this. And people were so misinformed that they just carried that opinion to the next person. And then we've had the privilege to teach a class at NC State, the Encore class on Lessons of Vietnam. And one of our subjects was the war at home. And we titled one episode, those who waited. And we were lucky enough to bring in front of the class wives of Vietnam veterans and ask them questions about what it was like sitting home for a year, not through our eyes, because you know what we think. We've talked about it enough. Let them have the floor and let the audience ask questions. Bill, I don't think we had a better class.
Yeah. To a certain extent, I think my wife is as much a Vietnam vet as I was, because she endured what was going on back here, plus what she saw. And because what she saw didn't tell the full story, that your mind has a tendency to create things. So the people back here, even the war protesters, we've met and talked to some of them.
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
We respect them for basically what they did, and we don't believe in it necessarily. But that was one reason we were there, to give them the right.
The right to be different.
As I've often said, I respect to a certain extent Muhammad Ali, because he said he didn't believe in going and didn't go, and he took the consequences. He didn't go to Canada.
Right.
He didn't do anything else. They stripped him of his titles and so forth. And he did serve. But he could have gone in and would never have gone to Vietnam. He could have served his country by going in and doing fighting, or just going around and seeing the troops.
He'd have been like Elvis Presley. He'd have been a legend.
Yeah.
Well, he was a legend. But, another thing, too, about the people at home and the war protesters, we met a couple, as you mentioned. We've had to go into class, talk to the kids, because we want to stress the point. In the war at home, there were a lot of people that were angry and wanted to voice their opinion. And some thought going to Canada and defecting from the draft was the courageous thing to do. And you have to listen to these men and women, because some took their families with them. Some never came back from Canada. Some came back. They got pardoned by Jimmy Carter, your favorite president. And they started many things like this. But the thing I always tell the guys is this: I respect you, and you have the right to dissent and to protest against the war, but not against the warriors. Yeah. The men and women that go to fight are told to by their nation, and they go willingly, and some give their lives. We all give our time. But the effort itself is political, usually. You could defend that. You could argue against it. But welcome the soldiers home, back to the country. And if there is a war at home, help them through it, ask good questions, accept the answers, and move on.
Bob, one of the things that I wanted to take a moment while we still got a little bit of time, at the end, actually the war had ended.
Yes.
And we had one of our boats, it was a merchant marine boat, I believe, or ship, that was captured by the Cambodians.
Yes.
What was the name of that ship?
It was called the Mayaguez.
Mayaguez. Okay. And 30-some sailors were captured and held hostage.
By the Khmer Rouge.
By the Khmer Rouge, okay. Right. We sent in troops to rescue these people, and it's kind of interesting. By the time we got there, they had been released.
Yes. And
were on another boat going back. But in the process, we lost several helicopters shot down. The Khmer Rouge actually put on a big fight. We had helicopters shot down. We lost about 24 men.
Yes, we did.
To were killed in action there. We got the men back and got the ship back, I understand.
Yes, we did.
And got back. But to make a long story short, when we got all the troops back, somebody went, whoops. They left three Marines on the beach.
On the island.
During the conflict of war and everything that's going on and shooting and all plans go out the window, things get a little hectic. So when they got back, did a head count, they left 3 men on the shore. One of them was from North Carolina, Mount Olive, I believe, is Joseph N. Hargrove. They have since gone back. An organization called JPAC goes and investigates crash sites, battle sites, and so forth, and takes and gets remains and through DNA now contact the families and match up the remains to know who they were. They have gone back now and gotten the other 2 Marines. That actually those 2 Marines or 3 Marines lasted 2 weeks.
Yes.
We had planes fly over and boats or ships go by, and they couldn't find any sign of life. But it's known now those 3 Marines lasted 2 weeks fighting and hiding from the Khmer Rouge until they were captured and then killed. Hargrove's cousin has been back to Cambodia, has gone there and actually talked with the guy who actually killed Hargrove and showed him where it was. They've gotten the other 2 men out, but now JPAC says that it's not in their budget or in their time scan to go back. They're getting ready to bulldoze that entire area and make a resort out of it.
Yes, they are.
And what I'd like for our listeners to do to call, email, write JPAC and tell them that it's very important that we get Hargrove and bring him home. Don't let him become a piece of real estate for a resort. He was an American soldier. He went over there to do what we asked him to do. And for his family and for himself, we need to bring him back. We need to go back, go to where we know he's at, get his remains, and bring back. But unfortunately, there's a lot of politics. JPAC is underfunded, so they're planning on not going back. His sister and his family would sure like to put closure doing it.
Sure.
So if there's any chance whatsoever, contact JPAC. And Bob, you want to add to that?
I do. One of the dangers, I think, of the talking about the war at home and so forth is that you can't say the words, "I don't know." But once you say to people, please ask all the questions you want, what Bill just mentioned is a tough question about the MIAs. You'll see that flag flying all over North Carolina, all over the United States. You'll see it on my bracelets. You see it on cars everywhere. The symbol of the POW, the MIA. Some of our good friends are ex-POWs. They've spoken in our classes. One is named Mr. Bill Schutte. He's a good friend of mine, and he's one of my heroes. And I asked him one day, when did you think you were going to get rescued? He was in Hanoi Hilton 8 years. And he said, every day. Every day I woke up, I expected the Americans to kick that door down. He said, Bob, soldiers never give up. So we're asking you the same thing. When you think of Vietnam, when you think of different places you're driving around the country, you'll see a sign, Vietnam Memorial. You'll see a bridge, Vietnam Bridge. You'll be in D.C. and you'll see the wall. Put on your turn signal. Park your car and check it out. Knowledge is a wonderful thing. Ask hard questions and help us teach America, because our job is to teach a nation. And we're going to do this. The war at home is not over, but we are winning the battle, and now it's time to win the war. Mr. Dixon, I thank you so much for your knowledge tonight.
Okay, keep going. We got 6 more.
And I think one thing we should mention about the hard questions. You mentioned the Mayaguez. You really can't ask people to put themselves into harm's way if you wouldn't put yourself in harm's way to rescue them.
Yeah.
And the Mayaguez situation is very difficult because a lot of people, when Vietnam ended in 72 and 73, thought it was over. The Mayaguez was 1975.
Yeah.
And there was men still in Vietnam. And JPAC, I was invited at one time to go on a JPAC dig for 30 days into Vietnam and look at this airplane. It was sandwiched in a mountain pass and dig out the bodies and accompany them to the lab in Hawaii where they do the screening for the DNA. It's a very, very involved process. And it's something that the listening public needs to know, that we have not given up on our men in Vietnam, and we never will. It's just a slow, slow process. Even though the government declared them all dead, you and I both know they're not. There's people still there. There's MIAs and POWs that keep their fingers crossed. Next time the door opens, they won't have someone speaking English walking in. They don't give up. I don't give up. I don't expect you to give up. The war is not over. It's close to being over, but it's not over.
Well, you know, that's part of the war at home, was the giving these families closure. Their son, their brother, or their sister went off to fight a war, and they don't know one way or the other right now whether they're living or dead. I know we have a young lady that was very active with the POW issue. for a long time. She talked about that she remember her father bouncing her on his knee, and said, "Honey, I'll be back soon." And that was 40-some years ago, and he still hadn't come home.
Right.
And she, the one of the co-pilot with him has come home, but they don't know anything about her father and so forth. And to a certain extent, I think that's harder than knowing that your loved one was killed in Vietnam, because you don't know, you don't have that closure. To me, that's one of the hard parts of being the war at home was
it is
not knowing.
I had the privilege a couple of years ago to be asked to speak at the breakfast for the families of the missing Americans, and a question you never ask them, which people want you to ask anyway, is why don't you just give up and realize that it's over? You never ask that question, because they will never give up, and I wouldn't either. There's always a glimmer of hope. That doorbell will ring, the man will be in the door. It's one of those things that's it's very hard to explain.
Well, it's like today, if a child is missing, the parents always have hope.
Yes.
And never going to give up. That child's going to come back home. And unfortunately, quite often they don't. But
right.
You just never give up hope until you're proven otherwise. It's like the wives who are back home, our wives, yours and mine, and the other wives that came back home. They expected us to come back home.
Yes.
Because as I mentioned before, my wife told me if I got killed, she'd kill me.
And we did. Mr. Birthday Man.
So, coming back home, the effect and the continued effect, Vietnam was a long time ago. But you got a lot of families, 41 from North Carolina right still, who do not know one way or the other, who continuously hoping that someday they're going to know one of the answers, yes, he's still alive, or no, he's dead, but at least brought back home and be put in a family cemetery or in a cemetery and so forth.
Well, people will be buried, Bill, with their bracelets on. They'll never forget.
In 1 minute that we have, how do you explain why would they keep holding a prisoner today in Vietnam? You take prisoners so they can't fight. Mm-hmm. You hold them so you can negotiate later on, or you hold them in order to punish them.
Well,
some of those barbaric.
Part of the problem was we promised the North Vietnamese to give them money to fix their country back up from all our bombing. We didn't give them nothing. They have a long memory. One of our members was a POW escapee for Nick Rowe. Nick was later assassinated in the Philippines, and the communists were thought to be part of that. They say today there are no prisoners of war in Vietnam, but no prisoner of war from the United States has ever come home from Laos or Cambodia. Within the last 5 or 6 years, there have been Koreans who have escaped from Korean prisoner of war camps. There were Koreans, they were not Americans. They were kept in slave labor camps. But with the Vietnamese thought patterns, we didn't do what we were supposed to do, so why should they do what they're supposed to do? That's one of the reasons I feel like they're keeping him.
So,
and Bob, you have...
I just wanted to say, in 2 weeks from tonight, we will do the real meaty part of the war at home. And we're going to have a guest, a war protester. You'll like this. This guy has a lot of guts. I respect him. I do now, anyway. And thank you for tuning in tonight. It's been a blast teaching the hardest part of Vietnam is the war at home, because you never expect your enemy to live on your street.
Thank you, and be safe. Thank you, sir.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Sundays, 9 a.m. till noon. Carrie's Psychic Cafe with Carrie Silkowski, Sundays, 8 till 9 p.m. Health In with Debbie Bruck, Mondays, 11 a.m. till noon. Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Mondays, 1 till 2 p.m. Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, the second and fourth Wednesday of each month from 7:30 till 8:30 p.m. Reawaken Your Brilliance with Julie Seibert, Wednesdays, 9 till 10 p.m. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at www.nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by ThatVidBlasterGuy.com, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.